Hey guys, Ryan Hodge here. I want to spend some time today and go over a couple different settings in the FantasyLabs optimizer for creating teams for large field tournaments ranging anywhere from tens of thousands of people, even some smaller field tournaments, right? 1,500, 5,000, entries, things along those lines. I just want to show you some foundation settings, ways to leverage the optimizer here to help you get maybe a little bit more unique lineups, think outside the box, and just give you some foundation rules that you can apply on a weekly basis and then kind of tweak based off of the slate. So, well, actually, tell you what, before we dive into that, I do want to address there is no there's no setting that you can just leave and maybe change one or two other things and hit optimize and have these beautiful 150 lineups that are gonna, have a ton of leverage and are gonna give you these excellent shots at getting in the top 1%. Every slate is different, every contest is different, and everything needs to be treated as such, especially with the optimizer. This is just a tool that requires our input based off of maybe some feel that we have for the slate and a bunch of data, which Fantasy Labs offers as well, that we get to kind of then make adjustments to settings and the optimizer and looking at lineups and things like that. So I don't know, more of a just don't just copy and paste what I'm doing today type of a CYA here. And I just want to make sure that everyone is treating each slate as its own unique contest, or treating each slate as its own unique set of rules and each contest for their own unique set of roster construction and things along those lines. So without further ado, let's dive in. I don't want to spend a ton of time going over the model or like the stacks or the multi lineups or even like some of the great data that Fantasy Labs offers here. See, I've got the week one slate brought up for the 2021 season. Like all of this data is great. I'm going to go over this in other videos. What we're going to spend time on today is the optimizer. So you'll notice we've got a couple different menu items up here. One of them is the optimizer. When you click on that, you are presented with kind of just this blank canvas here, and where all of the magic happens is under the settings. So you'll notice I've got a lot of different settings in here. This is some of the pre-saved templates that I have. I'm going to clear all of this though and just kind of go over it one by one. So you'll notice you have this area where you can configure your optimizer settings. There's a getting started, and there's also this use wizard view, which is really a great tool. And I'll touch on it here. Basically, it says, do you want to stack? Yes. How much variance do you want? What do you want for some ownership rules? So on and so forth. And it can spit out a couple different rules for you under our positional rules. But we're going to go over that separately. So I encourage you to give that a look. But for now, let's spend time here under general. And the min salary cap, I leave it 99%. Most of the time, this is going to be the most optimal thing that you can do. Players versus opposing defense, I will keep it at 1, sometimes 2, just depending on the slate. DraftKings, it's a little bit different, where I'm okay having opposing because wide receivers can rack up, that extra half point versus FanDuel. They get that full PPR reception on full point per reception on DraftKings. And there's the bonus, which you don't have on FanDuel. So this will be site specific. Flex position, always going to be slate dependent. Sometimes there's really great value and so it's worth, using 2 tight ends. Sometimes there's not. So it really just depends on the slate. Our max salary cap 100% and max ownership per lineup. This will be basically how much of the projected ownership do you want to have in a lineup? And I'll touch on that a little bit more later. You can just set it at like 200 if you want to try and stay, fairly unique, but I actually go lower than that, and you'll see why here in a little bit. Our unique players per lineup, once again, slate dependent, if you want 1 or 2, but this basically will say every unique lineup out of 150, 300, 500, 20, it doesn't matter. Every lineup will have to have at least 2 unique players in it, 1 unique, 3 unique, 4 unique, so on and so forth. Now, what I really like to do is the range of outcomes here. For per player, we're going to basically set some variance. Now, I think quarterback and running back are a lot easier to project and a lot more predictable than some of these other positions. So, like defense, flip a coin, who knows? 50% on the variance works for me. And all this is saying is apply different levels of diversification when you're creating each one of those lineups, right? So if we set it to 5%, it'll adjust a player's projection minus 5% or all the way up to 5%, and it will be added to that entire player pool as it goes through each lineup. Now, wide receiver, I like to do a lot of variance, and tight end, I also like to do a lot of variance as well. So bounce, max exposure is great. I don't change this out of the gate. I will start doing this once I start fine tuning my lineups. I do think if you're doing like 150, you can just set it to 50 right out of the gate and then fine tune per player from there. But I actually won't when I first start running lineups just to see what is optimal, what it's really forcing in, and then as you comb through your player pool. So I don't change any of that out of the gate. Now, bounce is a great feature. Um, it it basically allows a player's projection to be decreased or to increase or recover that player's projection if they do or do not show up in the next set of lineups. So it's a great way to ensure that you're getting a proper amount of a player throughout your lineups, especially if you're creating 300 or 450 and you're playing those throughout a bunch of different contests. This is a really great way to manage your exposure. Now, what I think is really great here, and I'm going to use this right now before I go into these other tabs, is Labs has these templates, and this is such a massive time saver. So under team, I don't leave any of this, but under position, this is where these templates come into play. Now, sorry, I skipped over this. I think this is once again slate dependent. I leave it all as is, but if you think that it is highly unlikely that the best lineup, the winning lineup, the one that's shipping a couple different contests, doesn't have, if you think a cult player comes from that, whether it's like Pittman or Taylor or whatever it might be, or if you think Robbie Anderson or DJ Moore or like some of these other high team totals like Tennessee or Atlanta, if you think one of those players is without a doubt, and this is usually going to be teams like Dallas, Green Bay, Atlanta, all of these teams who are at high paces carrying implied team totals of like 25.5 or higher. If you just think that one of those players is going to be in the optimal, like Kansas City here, I'll set my minimum to 1 and just say like, look, somebody from Kansas City is absolutely going to be in the best lineup, and so you can just set it to 1, right? I leave it 0 out of the gate, and I really focus on my positional rules, and this is the biggest time saver. Having these templates. So there are pro templates, and these are cool. This will just like load in a couple different rules. This is kind of what the wizard will give you, but I go much, much deeper than that. So I have a couple different templates saved here. I have one for 150, and then I have a large field GPP rule or template here, but that's more on this on a skinny stack where I think you have to be perfect, right? So if you're firing 150 lineups, I think you absolutely have to be perfect. But for the contest that I choose to play, it's okay to do a full onslaught because I'm typically playing in contest field sizes that are 2,500, 5,000, things like the power sweep or the game changer or a couple entries into the wildcat where you can just do full onslaughts. And we can use the FantasyLabs contest dashboard to even study that and prove that that works too. But enough about that. Let's focus on these templates because these are huge time savers. I'm just going to load in this template here, and you can see it saves all of these rules. Pair a quarterback with at least 2 wide receivers or tight end from the same team. Pair a quarterback with at least 1 wide receiver or tight end from the same team. And you'll see why I have these a little bit different. Now I want pair quarterback with at least one wide receiver tight end from the opponent team, right? So from the opposing team, I want to bring it back. And these are all correlation rules. But to go back to this, I think that there are a couple quarterbacks where the correlation does not make sense to have two of their pass catchers, let alone three. And those teams are usually going to be teams like or players are usually going to be teams like Kyler Murray, Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, where their rushing ability is taking away so much from the rest of the output of their ancillary players that I think it's good to just run it back with one, especially in big tournaments, Millie Maker Slant, the $3 20 max, things like that, where you have to be perfect. It's very difficult to take a seven from a wide receiver or a tight end in one of those and win, right? So I think you have to be very, very perfect. So when I have this, it's also making sure. So if it's not, and I need to change this from excluding. So if it's not these quarterbacks, then I still want to use two of their pass catchers. So if it's not Josh Allen, Kyler Murray, so on and so forth, I still want to use two of their pass catchers. If it is one of those quarterbacks, then I want to make sure that I still have at least one of them in there, right? So look, these rules, you can do a lot with these rules. There's a lot of different ways that you can pair limit. You can do tight end with exactly so pair a tight end with it exactly one running back from like you can get really, really crazy with these rules. I don't think you need to. I think this is a really good foundation from a week to week that you can then start making adjustments on. Now you'll notice it also defaulted some custom rules for me, but it didn't do any player correlations. And that's because player correlations are going to be on a week to week basis for me. So let's use a team like Carolina. So you've got Sam Darnold, who has just looked egregious, but we don't know if that was Adam Gase or not. But you may not end up with a lot of Sam Darnold, but guys like DJ Moore and Robbie Anderson, those are guys that you probably want in your lineup, right? Because Sam Darnold can still throw for 220 and 2 and have a poor day that's it's not fantasy relevant, but Robbie Anderson could catch 7, 109 and 1, and you may want a little bit of mini correlation with Robbie Anderson and the opposing wide receiver. So whoever Carolina is playing that week, you may not want a whole stack, but maybe you want some mini correlations. So if we grab Robbie Anderson, so when we use DJ Moore or Robbie Anderson in any lineup, so when lineups include, I want to increase whoever they're playing. I honestly don't know who they're playing in week one. So whoever they're playing, let's just say that they're playing the Chiefs. I want to increase Tyreek Hill and anyone else from the Chiefs, right? It could be, I mean, we could even do, I mean, Clyde Edwards-Helaire probably doesn't have the best correlation here unless it really turns into a shootout and he starts getting some targets. But typically, you would just put a bunch of the Chiefs wide receivers or the opposing team's wide receivers, and you would increase their projection by, let's just say, 30%. So when Robbie Anderson and DJ Moore are in a lineup, I want to increase all of the Chiefs pass catchers projections by 30%, or any player that I have listed here by 30%, giving us a much higher outcome and likelihood of getting those little mini correlations in some of those lineups without having to have a full game stack of their quarterback and another pass catcher and something along those lineups. So you can see there's a lot of different ways to use these player correlations here. So for instance, when lineups include all of, and I can do a full group, and I could say basically I would like to make sure that one lineup has, or all of these players are included in at least one of these players is included in every single one of my lineups, right? So if you've got this core group of players that you want, so when lineups include any of, use exactly 1, and you could do a big group here where you could basically say if any of these lineups contain Christian McCaffrey, I also want to make sure that it has any of these players, right? We could do Tyreek Hill, we could do Devontae Adams, we could make sure that it also has Aaron Jones. There's a lot of different ways to create some player groups here, which is really nice tool too as well. So give the player correlations a look. And this is always going to be slate dependent. That's why I don't have anything loaded here in my templates, because this is just based off feel of the slate. So player groups are great as well. So this is another way where it's a little bit different than the player correlations. So I want to use exactly one of, and this is where you can make sure that every single one of your lineups has at least or has exactly one of these players. So you are guaranteed in every single one of your lineups, you're going to have, and you don't want to do quarterbacks for this. You just want your game stacks to dictate that. Let's say this is your core. You've been looking at a bunch of different data and you've decided, I love these players. I want to make sure that I'm really exposed to these players. You can do that. I typically don't do this, but this is a way that you can use player groups and make sure that you're using exactly or at least one of, or at most, which is you can start limiting players as well. So it's a great way to use the player groups too. Now, what I use a lot are these custom rules. So this is how I can start to force a little bit of ownership into my lineups without having to, bump a player's projection just because he's low owned, something along those lines. So we can make sure that we're using at least one wide receiver where his projected ownership is less than 15%, and use at least one wide receiver or running back, one wide receiver and running back where projected ownership is less than 15%. Now, I'll come in here and change this based off of the slate. If I think that it's a very condensed slate, I might lower this, I might raise it. If I think that there's a lot more volatility to the slate and ownership seems to be a little bit more spread out. But this is a great way where we can also leverage where we can also use our leverage rating as well here in FantasyLabs. So I want one wide receiver where our leverage percentage is greater than, and I would set this to something like 98%. And I'll show you how I get that number here just based off of the player pool models. Oh shoot, for week 1 we don't have ownership projections and stuff yet, but typically you would see stuff like 97, 96. Those guys could still carry some good ownership even though they have a good leverage percentage. So I like to keep it nice and high. And there's lots of different ways you can do by ceiling. So I want to make sure that I have at least one. You'll notice I really do a lot of this with wide receivers because I think running backs are a lot easier to project. My player pool for running backs is usually much, much smaller, and I'm okay having chalk at running back too. So that's why I usually come in here and edit this just depending on the slate. But let's say I want to also have at least one player where my wide receiver ceiling is greater than, and I can go in and I can take a look at our projected ceilings that we have in FantasyLabs, and I can say, okay, there's 8 wide receivers who have a projected ceiling of 30 points or better. So I would just say, I want to make sure that I have at least one of those 8, right? So at least one player where their ceiling is greater than 30. You can also say exactly, like, you only want one of those. So there's a lot of different ways to use our custom groupings here, but you'll see everything comes back to it being slate dependent. And you'll notice my template has it set to max ownership of 190%. This, once again, I change based off of the slate. If I think that it's more or less condensed, I basically start to mess with this number and how unique and different I want my lineups to be throughout 150 or 300, so on and so forth. I will change this, and we can apply all of these settings. We can generate some lineups here, and that's in a nutshell, in a very quick nutshell. I realize that was probably only about 15 or so minutes of actual settings and how to use the settings, but feel free to go back, take a screenshot, look at a bunch of different stuff, set up templates, and start messing around with all of those settings. And then once you've generated your lineups, this is where we can start to tweak exactly what's happening with our rules, taking a look at our lineups. You'll notice I've got my player exposures over here showing exactly how exposed I am to each of these individual players. I can select Kyler Murray and see all of my Kyler Murray lineups now. Now, these are just my Kyler lineups. You'll notice when I have him selected, it says 100%. So in all of my Kyler lineups, I have 65% Hopkins, 51% Chris Carson. Where's my bring back? Oh, look at that. A.J. Brown and Frisker at 51 and 45% in all of my Kyler lineups. And this is that Arizona Tennessee game stack that we have there. What's interesting is you'll kind of notice there isn't a lot of Derrick Henry, and that's because the correlation here of just using those pass catchers versus having a running back in there. If Derrick Henry's having a great game, it's highly unlikely that AJ Brown or any of the other pass catchers like Julio and Frisker are really having that great of a game, especially from a touchdown equity standpoint. So you'll notice he's not in a lot of these lineups. But if we get rid of Kyler, it doesn't mean that we don't have any Derrick Henry. I mean, we very well could not, based off of the running back projection in the model. And I sorted, or I projected by their median points here, by their actual projection. You can also change that to ceiling too if you really want to work off ceiling projections, which I think is great. A little risky in 150 max, but you are aiming for player ceilings, so you could decide to only make 50 lineups based off ceilings and 100 based off of median projection. And what you can do there to kind of segue into that is we can save all of these lineups. And we could, sorry, I should have tagged them. I could have tagged those. Notice how it says unassigned. I could have tagged all 150 as Arizona Game Stack ceiling projected, right? And now you can go through and you can start to export these to, you can download the files and you can start to export these straight into DraftKings or straight into, I'm on DraftKings and from the model selection here, or FanDuel as well, right? So, or Yahoo or any of the other sites that accept CSV. But this is where you can now start to save. And what's really cool is when you actually have your DraftKings CSV contest selection uploaded into FantasyLabs, you'll be able to see how much of a player you have based off of your dollar amount as well as your overall lineup, right? So if you're playing 300 lineups, but maybe it's the slant and the milli maker, but you also have like 10 lineups that you might have hand built, and that could be like the game changer. Maybe you made 5 or 10 in the Wildcat. There's a big difference between having 2,500 or $3,000 in Kyler Murray throughout 50% of your Millie Maker lineups versus having $6,000 on 4 lineups throughout a couple different high stakes, and it really just opens your eye up to that if you're playing at those levels too, which you're probably aware of what you're doing, but it really does just be like, wow, my week is definitely riding on Kyler, right? When you see you've got like 6,000 next to his name or whatever it might be, or 600 or 60 or whatever it is relative to you. So it's a really great feature, and you can still go through and check it out by quarterback, by running back, wide receiver, and really just kind of see where your exposures and your dollar amount based off your buy-ins are. You can also check out your team stacks. So once again, this Arizona Seattle game definitely popping for us, and that's because I didn't set any limits on my players, right? So if I had gone back in under the optimizer settings, under the max exposure per player, and changed that to maybe like 20%, which is much more of a viable number for 150 or 300 lineups, we would obviously not be nearly as condensed. But this is underneath the My Lineups and Entries. It's a great way to manage everything that's happening without using like the site's interface. I really prefer this interface. It's so much easier to use. You can do global swap here. If something happens in the late slate, you can re-download all of your, or yeah, like news changes for the late slate and hasn't locked yet, you can re-download everything from DraftKings, re-upload it, and use the re-optimizer here. We can set our subset and we can submit, and we can make sure that we now have those changes based off of our model settings and any inputs that we have changed based off of the news, and get new players in lineups, even though we already have locked players, and then we can make those changes. It's a really, really nice way to deal with breaking news throughout the day and things like that without having to like do global player swaps in DraftKings. So, um, sorry, this is taking a bit longer because I'm also using my recording software. So all of this re-optimizing is doing a lot, plus my computer is trying to record all of it as well. But the re-optimizer is a really, really great tool. So I think that covers a lot of it in a very nutshell, quick way. If you have any questions at all, please leave them down in the comments. I always check the comments. I get notifications when you guys leave comments and replies. Or I'm on Twitter at Ryan Hodge. Please feel free to ask any questions that you have there. If there's something that I didn't cover that you would love to see covered, let me know as well. I'll be doing a lot more of these videos for Fantasy Labs, spending a lot more time and going over the intricacies and details of the model, how to adjust the model, how that works more with the optimizer settings. But I really wanted to just go through these main tabs here and give you guys a quick look at some of what I think are great foundation position rules to use in your Fantasy Labs optimizer settings. Keep in mind, this isn't just for 150 max either. You can do all of this for if you're doing 20 max in the $3, or if you're playing the single entry red zone or end zone, I think it is, the $75. You can use this tool and create those lineups right here in your lineup builder and still use these same settings. So it'll actually use all of the settings and player correlations and things that you've done to really open up your tool. So you see where it says use my optimizer settings? There we go. So now what I can do is I can be like, for my power sweep, I've got 3 entries. I'm going to hand build those. That doesn't mean we have to go to DraftKings and hand build there. We can use all of this data to our advantage, all at a glance right here with our projections, our ceilings, our ownership, our leverage scores, all of this data with snaps and spreads and Vegas information. And we can use the optimizer in Fantasy Labs to start getting a little bit of a hand build um, lineup with some math and data and using optimal stuff from the optimizer. So I can hit optimize here and let's just see what it gives me. And it'll follow those rules. So it does a full game stack. I already had Calvin locked for the bring back, and it locked in Kelsey, and it did a full game stack of that um, Philly and Atlanta game. And then from there, I mean, look at first glance, I think this lineup looks great. I think it's great for like a smaller field, 2,500, using the full onslaught with his receivers is totally fine in the smaller field tournaments, even though it doesn't really work in the large stuff because you have to be so, so perfect. But once again, any questions at Ryan Hodge on Twitter or drop them in the comments and I will be sure to reply. So appreciate you guys sticking through this one. It was a lengthy one, and run good this season. Cheers.